Good morning. I'd like to welcome all of you to the Kruse Economic Forum. This is our 20th year of putting economic forums out in the Kruse corridor. We want to thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Rob LeChevalier, and I'm with Buckley Law in Lake Oswego. Today, we're presenting an economic outlook from pandemics to climate change, adapting your business in 2021 and beyond. And we're really happy today to feature two senior economists, Dr. Michael Wilkerson and Dr. Mark Buckley from ECONorthwest. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box in your Zoom control panel. We'll monitor that box and have time for questions at the end of the presentations. We are also recording the program, and we will share the presentation and the speaker slides in a follow-up email. We also want to thank our sponsors, Buckley Law, Columbia Bank, Hoffman Stewart and Schmidt, JLL, UBS Financial Services, Pragma Group, Shorenstein Realty Services, Pamphlet Media, the Lake Oswego Review, and the Lake Oswego Chamber of Commerce. Without these sponsors, we could not have been putting on these great programs that we've had over the last 20 years. I'd like to give a warm welcome to our first presenter, Dr. Michael Wilkerson. Dr. Mike is a partner, a senior economist, and a director of analytics at ECONorthwest. He brings over 15 years of private sector experience as an economic consultant and as an analyst in the financial services industry. Mike studies urban economics for both public and private sector clients, with a focus on land use, transportation, and real estate development, and how they interact with the regional economy. Using a data-driven approach that focuses on spatial analysis, he conducts housing market analysis, development feasibility studies, transit-oriented development transportation studies, and master plans, economic impact analysis, and provides expert testimony. Dr. Mike is currently an adjunct professor in the Master of Real Estate Development program at Portland State. Dr. Mike?
Well, thanks for that introduction, Rob. It's a lot of words. Mike works fine for me. Let's go ahead and jump in this morning. We have two economists with the clock running, so typically our challenge is to see how many slides we can get through in the allotted amount of time. So Mark and I will have a little friendly competition here to see who comes out ahead on that battle. So I think for some perspective, really, we can look back at the last year, which probably has felt like a lifetime for many of us in the sense of, what were we doing in April of 2020? If you looked at some of the headlines from a year ago, the sky was literally falling. We had never seen the sheer number of people file initial claims for unemployment in US history. Not since the Great Depression have we seen unemployment rates as high as they were. That was happening at the same time. We had crazy things like toilet paper shortages happening. Nobody knew what had happened. We had never shut down the economy before at such a speed. And then we started doing things like talking about flattening the curve. We had these, we'll shut down for 2 weeks. That turned into 2 months, and here we are a year later. So I think for some perspective, it's always helpful to kind of see how quickly things have changed and what people's mindsets are. Because I think that's key in where we're at now is understanding, what are on people's minds. And the word you would hear used multiple times a day is certainly unprecedented. Myself and many of our colleagues, if you turn on the news, you probably see our president, John DePonia, out there every day. This was, an article that got posted on KATU. And at the time, this is again a year ago, we were saying, the return of the economy really hinges on how confident people are that the health crisis has been taken care of. I think that's similarly true today. Our crystal balls don't oftentimes work, but I think at the time, we were, I think, pretty on the mark in terms of how things have played out, which is really saying, when do people have confidence that you can go out into public, go back to a restaurant or at a bar, et cetera? And this again was April of last year, before we had any idea of when a vaccination would be coming out. And we looked at this closing, reopening, and really we were assuming recovery itself wouldn't happen until June. And I would describe what we've seen so far as we haven't really seen the recovery yet. And so what we're at the precipice of now is the vaccine rolling out en masse. And I think the key is, how is that going to impact consumer behavior and certainly businesses? But I think in terms of understanding where we're at today, we have about 7 or 8% fewer people working today than we did in February of 2020. For some context, the blue line is the last recession of 2007. It took 24 months to lose all the jobs. Then we lost all the jobs in 2 months this time. And so this is completely different. It took 5 years effectively for the recession to play its way out. And so in terms of just understanding where we're at today, we're 14 months in. This has, been, a pace in terms of loss and recovery that we haven't really seen. But what we're seeing now is, the pace of job recovery has been pretty muted over the last several months, including at 1 month in December, we had actually more people filing for unemployment or losing their jobs in that month than we had previously. There are a lot of lines on this chart. Let's focus on the red one. This is what the state economist is thinking getting back to full employment into pre-COVID levels will look like. And based on their latest forecast in March, they're thinking this is going to be sometime in 2023. I think what they're seeing is this kink in the curve where we're sitting in the slow growth path now. And they think, schools reopening next year is going to be the key to kind of sustaining that recovery. So I think between now and let's say the fall, we'll really have a much better idea about what the recovery looks like in terms of employment, potentially GDP growth, income, all of those variables. So what I wanted to do while I still have your attention before we drift off into many charts is kind of just at a high level, let's talk about these 10 factors that I would say we hear about on these are questions that I get asked probably, near daily is, what's going to impact the recovery? First and foremost, as is always the case, consumer confidence. A lot of that is going to be bounded by return to school. You have something like 17% of the workforce in Oregon that isn't able to work remotely and have school-age children at home and don't have more than one parent at home. So effectively, 1 out of 5 people, typically mothers, really are struggling with balancing work, school requirements for their children. Certainly most school districts are back in some stage now, but let's take Portland Public Schools, for example, if most students are in for 2 hours, 4 days a week, that's not really a long-term tenable solution for all those who are employed in typical sense. Pent-up demand is another one. That's going to be related to the American Recovery Plan, all the various stimulus, CARES, unemployment benefits, et cetera. Business formation, this is both on the closure side and also kind of what is happening in terms of new licenses. What does return to office work look like? So certainly in the Kruse corridor, this is a key consideration, but understanding what that looks like. Reputational damage to Portland is, top of mind, I think, for a lot of civic leaders in the city. Understanding what's happened on a migration basis over the last year when we don't really have great data to look at. What's happening in real estate? I could talk about that for 3 hours. And then inflation, which I don't need to put inflation on the list. Everybody wants to talk about it. There's nothing to see here. I could put in a slight caveat, but the number of times people ask me about inflation, the answer is I've been hearing about it for 20 years and it's never happened. And I have no good reason to think that something is going to change drastically in the next several months that's different than has unfolded over the last 20 years. So I think consumer confidence is tough. A lot of this is fueled by media and new media in terms of social media. Everyone has Twitter, Instagram, et cetera, are posting a million things. You hear about new cases all the time. And I think my suspicion is, and this is maybe a hope and also a suspicion, that we stop focusing on the new cases as the vaccine becomes more prevalent. If the vaccine is working in terms of its efficacy, and I'm not a public health, person, but I understand generally the idea of how people think the cases should still remain, but they're just going to be much less severe. And so if we move away from talking about how many people are testing positive who may have limited risk because of vaccine and focus more on hospitalizations and ultimately preventing people from going to the hospital. I think that's really gonna, and ultimately if you can prevent people from going to the hospital, you can reduce deaths. That's gonna be that chain of events that's really gonna help people feel more confident going out in public. And you're already seeing, I think a change in behavior already with vaccinations on the rise. You see that anecdotally and starting to see that in the data. In terms of spending is one of those places you can see that. And so here is a lot going on the chart. The big takeaway is if you look at retail spending pre-pandemic, it's up 17%. The orange bars to the left are, when over the first 2-3 months of the pandemic, everything came to a grinding halt. So you can see, things are down, restaurants, et cetera, 50%. The blue line is since April, how much things have recovered over the last year. And so when the blue lines are bigger than the orange lines, that basically means we have more spending in that category today than, net we did pre-pandemic. And across the board, it's up with the exception of restaurants and bars. And again, this varies a lot nationally in places like Texas, Florida, et cetera, that have completely reopened. Their recovery looks a lot different than we're seeing in Oregon and in the Northwest. So that's just an example of, one of the ways you're starting to see the behavior change. I think, so people with jobs, right, is the key. If you don't have a job and you're receiving unemployment benefits, certainly you're feeling the brunt, and that's concentrated in the leisure and hospitality industries and other places. But in aggregate, incomes are up across the board. So here you can look at state by state, literally incomes are up in every single state pre-pandemic. So when you're looking at what's the impact to individuals, this is including transfer payments. So if you're unemployed and you're getting CARES stimulus and ARP plus pandemic assistance, et cetera, when you look at that person's income on aggregate, it's up. Certainly some people are down, some people are up, but in aggregate across the board, and this is not what you would typically think of in a recession. And Oregon is amongst the highest in terms of what that personal income looks like. If we unpack what's going on, it's really the stimulus and all the other programs are what's causing the bump. And so incomes in aggregate are up 5%. You saw in Oregon, it's up higher. If you take out all of the government assistance, they're actually down 2.5%. So that delta is really what's happening in terms of if you remove all of those programs, and we're heading to a point now where this may be the last major bump. But you see in January when ARP payments came in, there was a big bump similar to their CARES payments, et cetera, in the middle of last year. This chart is a little bit complicated, but let me describe to you what's going on. Savings rates hit historic highs early on in the pandemic and have sustained effectively much higher than typical rates. And really what savings is the difference between, right, what people earn and what people spend. So if you look at all of those black dots, that's like going back to the 1950s. And you can see there's a very strong relationship in that personal income equals, X amount of personal consumption. And it's not one-to-one, right? People aren't spending as much as they're making, but that line is very straight going back 6 decades. Then you hit all those red dots. Those red dots are all below the line, which means people are earning more, right? The dots are moving to the right, but they're spending less. And those are all literally every single month is atypical in this last recession that we've seen. And what that difference is savings. So some of those dots are much lower, which means people are still earning a lot, but spending a lot less. And so this is, I think, one of the keys to understanding, what's pent-up demand look like. Pent-up demand looks like savings. And then the question is, how much of that are people going to spend? An example that I use typically is you can't have pent-up demand for groceries, right? You're going grocery shopping and you buy things. Now, toilet paper may have been the opposite of pent-up demand, right? This is, freak out behavior where people are hoarding things, right? This is the opposite definition. So to date, we've seen many more examples of buying out of fear rather than pent-up demand. But I think we'll see over the course of the summer which categories of spending continue to recover. And this is going to be key, I think, into looking at how quickly recovery happens. You look at many of the most impacted industries, food and beverage, leisure and hospitality, events, those types of things. Those are restricted by the government in terms of the share of the capacity they can have, and also based on consumer preferences. So that's really going to determine how quickly some of those industries come back. What we've seen is a little bit counterintuitive. I think as we head into recessions, right, you typically see business formations drop and then they quickly recover. And what we've seen is over this course of this pandemic, we did see a steep decline for the period of 1 or 2 months. Since then, business formations in Oregon have increased and are off the charts, higher than they've ever been. And again, this is one half of the equation. The other half of the equation, of course, is business closures. Closures is really hard to understand at this point in time for a number of reasons. One, PPP really helped some businesses not really generate income, but figure out ways to stay open. And we see new programs coming out specific to restaurants, et cetera. So I think what we're going to see here is, if these new businesses are able to adapt to the new environment, figuring out how to use technology, different delivery service methods, et cetera, is really going to be the key to kind of continuing to evolve into whatever the new normal looks like. In terms of scale, I think everyone kind of lives in their own little bubbles. So, if most of us work in professional services, we just assume everyone's working at home. But that's not the case. If you look at people who are now working at home differently than they did prior to the pandemic, nationally, this is around 25%. Oregon's a little bit higher. Where Mark lives is the #1 Zoom city in America, in Bend. And Oregon, is above the US average, but it's right in line with what you're seeing in California and actually below Washington at, a little less than 30% of the workforce working at home. So, if you're in the office sector, typically, yes, you're working at home, but in terms of, is everyone working at home? They absolutely aren't. So this is one of the things we can continue to track going forward. In terms of what does it look like when we return to work? I think, early on in the pandemic, you just hear news stories, everyone's going to remote work. No tech workers will ever work again in the office. Everyone's moving out to remote locations. And then, as the pandemic started dragging on, JLL did some surveying, I think late last year, and looked at, what's actually happening. And maybe not surprisingly, a quarter of the people don't want to work in the office at all. A quarter of the people want to work 100% back in the office again. But the other 50% want some type of a hybrid solution that I think most employers typically were pretty reluctant to do prior to the pandemic. For us as consultants, we have 50 people at EcoNorthwest. We work in 5 different offices. And so we were kind of in this notion of, yes, we work remotely across offices, but we still kind of had this expectation that everyone's going to show up to their place, even if all of the people they're working with might be in Portland, Seattle, LA at the same time. There's no real need to do that. I think everyone's gotten much better at this. And so this hybrid model, I think, is what we're going to see playing out much more so, rather than work from home, don't work from home kind of binary choice. In terms of surveying, I think, most people are in the 2-3 days a week category, but you still see, the majority of people at 3, 4, 5 days is kind of what they're thinking about. We did a survey of our employees, and I think 3 days a week in the office was the key. So I think figuring out how to collaborate, right, consistently is going to be key here. If people are in 3 days a week and it's just haphazard based on whatever works best for their schedule, versus everyone being in office, let's say Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, is going to require different modes of working with each other. I think the key to all of this, particularly in, let's say, professional services, right? I'm assuming most people on the phone are lawyers, real estate, et cetera. It's really about, what do the clients want? If the clients are okay with meeting remotely, you can be much more efficient now with your time, right? Nobody likes 8 hours a day of back-to-back Zooms, but you couldn't have done 8 meetings when you had in-person meetings with time in between, travel, et cetera. So if people want to continue to do that, I think that will be telling in terms of, how efficient people can be. In terms of kind of medium term and longer term prospects, I think one of the things we hear most about is Portland in the news, and particularly the connotation of, with a negative connotation. This is really about, I think, city of Portland, but I think the stigma when we talk to people around the country is they don't really understand the difference between city of Portland and the rest of the region, or particularly the small part of the downtown that has been largely affected versus even the rest of the city. But you just see headlines all over the place, some of them from the Oregonian, which, aren't helpful, with things like Dumptown. You have people like Nicholas Kristof, who writes for the New York Times, who's from Portland, saying, I don't really know what's going on here, but what's happening. So this is one of the key, I think, themes that the city is now aware of, city of Portland, but it has regional implications. One of those implications here we can see is a survey from Travel Portland. And so what they've done is consistently on a quarterly basis gone out nationally and said, what do you think about Portland, right? And at the peak in early 2020, most people thought of Portland as an appealing destination. Very few people thought of it as unappealing, and you had some neutrals. And then over the course of 2020, what you saw play out was actually more people at the end of 2020 found Portland to be unappealing versus appealing. So a drastic reversal. What we've seen, at least early indications of, is this is starting to kind of go back to where it was, but certainly not where it was at the peak, which would have been, Portland's perception as being basically entirely favorable. One of the reasons I think this is crucial is Oregon typically, like most states, has had natural population increases, which is to say, in any given month or year, more people are born than die. And the demographic trend has been very key here. And certainly some increased deaths due to COVID, unfortunately, have increased the pace at which we thought this was going to happen. We thought this was still 2-3 years out. But in 2020, the blue line shows you effectively there is no more natural growth in Oregon, and this will continue basically indefinitely looking at the demographic trends. That's a long way of saying if we're going to grow in terms of the number of people in the state, it's going to be done entirely through migration. And certainly people move from other parts of the state to Portland. So, Portland is a little bit different. Bend, similarly, now you're seeing some of that move to those more urban desirable or maybe previously desirable places. I have some data that kind of look at that in a moment, but I think the key here is we need migration now going forward. And so understanding, what's going to draw people to the region is much more important than it probably ever has been to the health of the regional economy. The data is terrible. And this is the most important question I think people have been wanting to understand. You look at census data, for example, the latest we have is 2019. Portland State does their best to estimate what population growth is, but they're not out there surveying every single person in the state. They have, models, but they're not great. The best we have, I think that's timely, is the post office does a change of address. And so again, this is not 100% accurate, but I think it's a very good indicator. And CBRE has done some extensive research. I think they released a couple of days ago looking at the top 30 markets in terms of, if you looked at migration during COVID 2020 and the year before in 2019, what you can see is actually many of those markets saw an uptick in migration. What you see on the right-hand side is where all the media focused its attention, right? Places like San Francisco, New York, Seattle, LA. Those places saw a pretty marked reversal. But if you look at the rest of the top 30 markets, Portland sits right at that inflection point, a slight increase in migration in 2020 relative to 2019, but Portland is ranked 21st out of the top 30, and then the other 9 markets are negative. So this just kind of gives you a sense of where we sit, which is to say, we're not Seattle, but we're certainly not places like Sacramento, San Antonio, Austin, et cetera. So that's a helpful, I think, recent data that we've seen. Another hypothesis that we've heard play out in the media, and I get asked this question all the time, is, are people fleeing the urban core, being Portland, and moving rural? And early on, we had some anecdotal data. This kind of tells a pretty, I think, comprehensive story that yes, where you see the migration happening, so this is on a scale of 1,000 people, basically 8 people out of 1,000 have been leaving the urban core on a migration basis, or every 1,000 people that migrate in and out, right? Early on, you saw the rural and semi-rural places being positive. That's reversed course quite a bit, certainly in the last quarter, in terms of rural and semi-rural going negative again. So I think there was this rush early on of people who could do that. Now we're starting to get back to a sense of normalcy. But again, you see the growth happening in these peripheral areas, urban growth, suburban, places like, frankly, like Kruse and in and around Lake Oswego, those types of places versus these true urban cities. So I think as we get better data on this, we'll be able to confirm the extent to which this is happening. But Portland is certainly, not one of the places that's seen a mass exodus. And I think this is going to be key going forward. Housing, I think Rob mentioned in his takeaway, this is where I spend most of my time talking. So let me spend a couple of slides here, and hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. But for those of you who follow real estate, Robert Shiller is probably the preeminent economist in this place. He created with the Case-Shiller index. He's called the last 2 bubbles popping, both in the stock market .com era and the housing era before anyone else, and has been consistently correct. And he wrote an article in the New York Times saying the housing boom is already gigantic. How long can it last? And I think a key part of this is he's saying we are once again experiencing one of the greatest housing booms in US history. How long will this last? And where is it heading next? And I think this could have been written yesterday, right? Is what you seem like was the case. But this was written back in December of 2018. And so whatever he saw happening at the time, certainly he had no idea COVID was happening, but he looked at the fundamentals of what was happening and was already starting to contemplate that. What we've seen play out since, I think, is much more than he ever assumed would happen in terms of prices. You can look at here the 20 markets that Case-Shiller tracks. This is the most accurate way to look at housing. You can look at median home prices being reported out of the realtors and RMLS. That's not really reflective of what's happening because of in places like Bend, for example, you have a shift from almost no lower priced homes being listed and subsequently sold, and many, $750,000 $1 million plus homes being sold. And so that just moves the median up. What you care about as a homeowner is how much is your house worth today versus what was it worth a year ago. And that's what the Case-Shiller does. And you can look at Portland at 10% is, similar to all of these places. You can literally look at any of the markets and they've all gone up to that 10% number. In many places, including San Francisco and Seattle, are actually dipping into negative in late 2019. Why is this happening? Okay, I disagree. I don't think we're forming a bubble. I think this is a much more sound real estate market than we've seen in the last two cycles for a number of reasons, particularly around credit underwriting standards, types of loans that are issued, and the amount of equity people have in their homes. And the number of homes that we've been building is nowhere near keeping up with the demand for housing. And so for all those reasons, it's a much more stable market than we've ever seen. This line looks in the Portland metro and it looks at, the number of homes sold. And if you look at this line, you'd say, where's the pandemic, right? If you just look at that seasonal cyclicality, we know in March, April, sales pick up through the summer, then they dive down again. If you look at March of this year, sales are higher, quite a bit higher than they were in the last 2 years, but you really can't see a pandemic anywhere in looking at just the volume of sales. When you look at the number of homes listed, you don't need a PhD in economics to see something is different. What's different is the number of homes listed is less than half of what it was at this time a year ago, close to a third of the number of homes listed for sale as we saw in 2019. And so, it's a cliche, it's supply and demand, but when you look at the number of homes listed for sale versus the number of homes selling, you literally have less than a month of supply. Those two lines are the same. We've never seen a market at this level of strain in terms of what's happening. Days on the market is less than a week typically, or on average. Prices going above, ask or commonplace again, multiple bids. This is very atypical from what we've even seen in previous hot markets in the region when the lines got close to each other, but never have they crossed. Another way of thinking about this is, certainly not everyone looking to buy a house owns a house, right? Renters are part of that pent-up demand as well. And so here you can just look at this number of renters effectively per home available for sale. So what you have is, and obviously not every renter is looking to buy, but it's just a good indication of how to whack the market's gotten. You have something like near 35 renters for every single home listed for sale. And typically that number has been in the teens, even late last year was in and around 25. So you've seen just a huge uptick here is another way of thinking about why we're seeing what we're seeing. You would think, given all of this demand, incomes being higher than they've ever been, right? Job losses amongst homeowners being relatively low, et cetera, that we would see this massive building boom. And we aren't seeing that at all. In fact, we're seeing the exact opposite of that. Here's apartments. We can talk single family as well if people have questions, but apartments under construction have fallen off a cliff. This was happening prior to COVID. We knew this was going to be happening, but in the last year, the number of new permits has been effectively near zero. In the metro, city of Portland, pretty much anywhere. City of Vancouver is really the only place that's maybe continued the pace that they were on previously, but a 45% drop in terms of the numbers. And we can look at this with certainty and say, we know this is going to continue now for the next 2 to 3 years, because the number of permits coming in versus the number of deliveries or number of units that are finished and available for occupancy is going to continue. And so this is going to lead to, right, certainly a period 2-3 years from now when there are, in the region could be less than 3,000 units under construction, in the city of Portland, back down to, maybe under 1,000 again here pretty soon. Those are numbers we haven't seen in a long time. But I think for some context, if you look at the run up in the last housing market, we're still way above those levels. And so we've just had this very abnormal peak, part of that fueled by investors' appetite to be in Portland. But if you kind of look at historically where we're at, we're just heading back down now into what is a much more normal rate of production. So takeaways here, and make sure I leave some time for marking questions. Now, I think this recession is much different than we've ever seen before for a variety of reasons, particularly around income and savings rates. The key, I think, is understanding how our clients being impacted. So for example, early on, if you were working in the public sector, you assumed that public sectors were going to be decimated. The state assumed a 17% across the board budget cut. What actually happened was revenues were higher in 2020 than they were in 2019, and they're continuing to project revenue growth going forward on top of huge amounts of government stimulus. And so how does that going to impact further when restrictions ease? And when you're thinking about planning for growth, what is your baseline? Do you go back to what you were assuming was the case pre-COVID? Are you now adapting to that? So I think that's, from a business kind of adaptation standpoint, key into what's going on. We went from, in May, the conversation of, can you guys see my screen, to now everyone's done with Zoom. What does that look like going forward, particularly in a professional services environment? I think crucially, this is an inflection point for government where they have the opportunity to change business as usual. So looking at typically disadvantaged communities, women, BIPOC communities that have been earning less relative to white populations, et cetera. This is an opportunity now with this infusion of hundreds of millions of dollars to cities and billions of dollars to states to really look at, okay, we haven't really had any revenue offsets. So this is just pure stimulus. What can we do with that money to change the way we think about doing business and to change outcomes for people? And so rather than the knee-jerk reaction of just spending the money as quickly as we can, this is an opportunity to really think about, right, as economists, what those benefits are relative to those costs with those dollars. I think lastly, the lack of new construction is going to lead to rent increases over the next couple of years as the new units are absorbed, and continued price increases on the single family front. And I think the two caveats here are, migration, which appears to be strong, and mortgage rates. So if mortgage rates go up quite a bit, that erodes the purchasing power. So that's kind of a quick synopsis. I will, at this point, hand it over to my colleague, Mark, for some higher level, long-term look at things, and look forward to some questions and after the fact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark Buckley. And I was listening to Mike's presentation, I was thinking about the fires last year and how as the smoke came in and we had the evacuation orders, we escaped to the coast for part of that time. And I called myself a climate refugee. So I think, Mike, Dr. Mark, I'm going to just quickly go over your bio. And my question is going to be at the end of your presentation, are we all climate refugees? So you could think about that. Dr. Mark Buckley. Mark is a partner, senior economist at ECONorthwest. He leads the natural resource practice there and designs and manages economic analysis, typically involving water resources and land management. Mark specializes in bringing intuitive, a strategic approach to understanding individual and group incentives to account for decision-making and policy design. He focuses on context-specific scarcities to understand the real value of goods and services, whether they be market or non-market. He's conducted cutting-edge research integrating restoration of ecosystem services within heavily used areas, including urban, and better understanding and designing systems to provide economic benefits from joint investments in natural and physical capital. He's published research in peer-reviewed journals, edited books, and also serves as an adjunct professor for environmental economics at Portland State University. Thank you, Dr. Mark, and take it away.
Thanks, Rob. Let me, I'm gonna pull my slides up here. Okay, you guys can see this okay? You can hear me fine? Sounds good. So I'm gonna jump right in. As Mike said, I'm going to be talking about some of the long-term implications that we're thinking about. I work in natural resources. Most of my work is for state and federal resource management agencies. And I'm going to talk about wildfire and water as two issues specific to Oregon to think about, and try to connect this to how businesses should consider these questions and try to prepare where it makes sense to prepare and what are some of sort of the underlying principles that we want to keep in mind as we think about strategies moving forward. So what we're thinking about here, what I'm trying to talk about, are what are the kinds of disruptions and disasters that that we should worry about? What are the options for preparing and investing? What are the scales of investment that we want to think about, whether we're a community, a government agency, an individual business, a household, and how do we balance budget constraints? Ultimately, what we're trying to do as economists in this situation is think about how do we allocate scarce resources? What is the trade-off scenario that makes the most sense for us? Some of the kinds of scenarios that we're thinking about here in the medium and long term, and I think COVID has helped us understand the differences and trade-offs available for different kinds of preparations or reactions, that we've got predictable, regular types of disasters or disruptions like drought, flood, heat waves, wildfire. And then we have unpredictable earthquakes, tsunamis, even volcanic eruptions, pandemics, obviously, that we're dealing with now. And in Oregon, we have a good understanding of what climate change is likely to do to some of these. Understandably, we're not going to be able to predict individual events in any way, and a fair amount of the science around climate change is about the unpredictability, the changes in severity, frequency, even it's sometimes called non-stationarity, that we deviate from normal trends and patterns, and how people make decisions and think about investments in this changing context is pretty difficult. So I think we need to come back to sort of basic principles of when it makes sense to invest and when it, frankly, when it doesn't. So some of the key issues from a climate perspective for Oregon that we've got to worry about are extreme heat events. These are sort of the priorities from Oregon's climate adaptation framework that the state has taken over, or all agencies are trying to react to. Extreme heat events, changes in water quality and timing of water availability, wildfire frequency and intensity, ocean acidification, increasing drought, coastal erosion and flooding with inundation, changes in the abundance and geography of plant and wildlife species and habitats, disease, invasive species, loss of natural habitats and wetlands in particular, and ecosystem services that a fair number of communities rely upon in Oregon, extreme flooding events, and then the landslides, especially those that can come after fires and precipitation, major storms that follow. So we'll probably continue to see landslide events, erosion events from last year's fires for a while. As we say, wildfire is something that is increasing in importance, and the challenge in Oregon of how we react to it, it's quite variable across the state. This one chart on the left, I couldn't find a good one like this that was updated to the end of all of our fires from last year. We ended up with over 1 million acres that burned in Oregon in 2020, so quite a bit more than this chart shows. But even though California, the top of these stacks, has historically had more fire than us, Oregon is starting to catch up, especially if you think about area proportion. So I often think from a natural resource perspective, especially on fire and water availability, that what we see happening in California is often a little bit of a look into the crystal ball in the future. So it's often useful to see what is going on and how people react down there. And I'm going to go into an example of some of our work on fire in California and how it relates to how we should think about fire up here in Oregon moving forward. But again, Oregon is highly variable from the east side to the west side, and the strategies and the investments that are needed are going to vary quite a bit as well. Quite related to the fire issue is water scarcity. And again, Oregon is a state that has pretty high variability in terms of water availability and scarcity. This year for 2021, we're looking at some serious drought problems down in the Klamath Basin. The federal Klamath Project of Reclamation has basically announced there's going to be no water available to farmers down there this year. Farmers are already trying to figure out what they're going to do. Are they going to try to find water from other extremely expensive sources? Are they going to move their operations and try to go farm in some other region? The Deschutes Basin Wickett Reservoir is at its lowest level in recorded history for the start of the irrigation season. So long-term investments and adaptation around water is something that the state is focused on pretty heavily as well. Quite a bit of legislative effort on both of these issues in terms of fire and forest management and water supply, and what are the investments needed, and what is the mix of local, private versus state versus federal across both of these issues. So that's where I'm going to try to go with this talk a little bit, how we think about these investments at the state level. A lot of the challenge here is how do we understand the probabilities and the values at stake that we're thinking about. So I want us to try to dig into the specific incremental implications of these changes that we're expecting over time. The shifting probabilities, the increasing uncertainties make this decision making quite difficult. Economists have thought about this for quite a while, but unfortunately our behavioral science is teaching us that people have a hard time weighing and balancing different magnitudes of value and probability. And one of the key underlying themes in this is, when is it cost effective to be proactive and make investments beforehand versus wait and see and react, and even make investments to try to be more efficient when it's time to react. So there's a range of types of investments, and this carries from fire to water and other climate related and natural resource management medium to long-term issues. What I always try to do as a starting point on these things is try to understand what are the changes that are likely to occur, what are the opportunities to react to those changes beforehand and after, and what are the real incremental differences. Because I think one of the challenges here is when we have big problems like droughts and wildfire, we feel like we should do more, we should have done more, we should be more active beforehand, we should be more aggressive during the problem. And the question comes down to, what can you really do? What are those incremental investment opportunities? How much are they going to cost? And what is the real change going to be? I'm going to carry this through a couple of case studies. I'll try to move fast because I know we don't have a lot of time. From a business perspective, and we do this as a firm ourselves, and I'll talk about some of these examples, is we want to be as sort of precise as we can with thinking about what exactly is going to be disrupted, where in our overall supply chain for what we're doing, or even if you're a government agency or a community, things you're trying to achieve, exactly how are, say, for example, wildfire or drought going to affect us? Obviously, it's going to affect professional services, very different than agricultural services. How households are going to react is going to differ quite a bit across the state. And the availability of substitutes to react when you lose access to one of these resources you rely upon, and how adequate and expensive those substitutes are, gets to be a very useful way to think about what your investments should be. So understanding those scarcities in any of these scenarios is where I try to start with the problem. And one of the biggest challenges for investment and reaction is how concentrated the benefits and costs are. So for wildfire and drought, when you've got very concentrated benefits and let's say proactive or reactive opportunities that are also very concentrated in terms of one actor, one institution, one company can sort of take care of what they need to do on its own, it's usually often more efficient to allow folks to make those decisions, those investments on their own. But when it's diffuse, when it's at a regional level or state level, and I think for wildfire and water, what we're increasingly seeing is that those investments are needed at a state level. It becomes more of a coordination problem and thinking about how the state needs to react. one of the things I've put together when we think about these kinds of decisions and how we prioritize what our investments are is to think about high versus low preparation costs and high risk versus low risk of not being prepared. And so clearly, if we're thinking about scenarios where you've got low preparation costs and high risk, you want to start there. That's where you want to put your time and effort in initially. Where you've got high preparation costs and low risk, that's your lowest probability. Lowest priority. And the important point here is to try to systematically think about what the risks are that an agency, a business, a community are going to face, and what the costs are of reacting and what the returns are on those reactions. One area that we've learned quite a bit about this over the last decade or two is thinking about preventative medicine, especially as we've moved towards more and more public involvement in medicine, is that preventative investments sometimes make sense, but they don't always make sense, that we're going to be treating all sorts of potential illnesses or people who don't face either high cost consequences or high probability of consequences. And I think we need to think about wildfire issues, water issues in a similar way, sort of trying to sort out where that preventative investment upfront makes sense and where it doesn't. Another example I think about quite a bit is the challenge of doing these sorts of problems, dealing with these kinds of problems under strong or weak governments. And a little bit of a tangent, but I did quite a bit of work in Fiji a couple of years ago when we were trying to help the national government and some regional governments adapt for climate change themselves. And it's very different and illuminating environment or say social context to deal with because there's such weak land tenure. Property rights are incredibly weak in Fiji. I think when I was working there had been 4 coups in the last 20 years, and farmers were increasingly having their land nationalized. So that meant that farmers didn't want to invest in their soil, maintaining soil fertility. They would just hammer the soil until it was basically worthless. There was no investment in irrigation or water storage equipment, even when it was incredibly cheap. There was no investment in roads or their broader sort of transportation systems or coastal protections. And this all came down to the land tenure issue. Even though climate change is as real there as anywhere, they have nearby nation islands that have had to be abandoned and have taken up in their own areas. And the key point that I've seen here is how important a clear alignment of beneficiaries with those investments are necessary. And so this scales out similarly, that if we see big consequences of fire or drought or climate change in general, if you don't have good alignment of those who will make the investments to protect or prepare with those who are bearing the cost, you're not going to see very effective outcomes. And I want to do a little bit of a description of this case study that we spent quite a bit of time on, working with all sorts of different biophysical technical scientists, fire modeling, water quality modeling, debris flow modeling, to think about in California in one of the major watersheds, the Mokelumne Basin. If you can see here, my arrow, it drains from just a little bit south, the Tahoe Basin. It's the primary water source for East Bay, down in San Francisco Bay Area, and lots of power. PG&E has some of their highest concentration of hydropower in this basin. So the idea with this work was lots of resources at risk, lots of wildfire risk. This work started in probably 2013 or so, 2012. And all we need to do is get everyone to coordinate to invest, to do the fuels treatments and buffer the region against wildfire risk. There's also lots of private timber assets, communities, homes, infrastructure, and federal land in this stage. And as I said, we had pretty extensive science modeling. It's still seen as the most heavily modeled scenario for fire and fuels treatment nationally. And it's still kind of the reference case because there was so much science that went into it to show what the benefits of fire risk and fire investment would be. We modeled a series of potential fires in the basin. These smaller circles are sort of showing the perimeters of our modeled fires, whereas the rim fire that hit Yosemite National Park while we were doing this work was on the size of this larger red block. So we were being relatively conservative with the fire scenarios that we had. But still, we were showing that the fuels treatment, the difference in the severity, frequency, damages from the fire were much lower. And these green bars over here on the left are the size of the fuels treatment expenses we're talking about, sort of like 20 to 70 million in terms of investment, whereas the benefits are in the hundreds of millions easily that we were showing. And this, again, we were trying to be relatively conservative. But one of the problems is it goes across a whole range of different kinds of benefits. And if you look at the beneficiaries, and this is the real alignment problem, challenge of getting the benefits and the beneficiaries well aligned with the cost in a proportional way. PG&E ended up being the major stakeholder in this whole process that pulled out and did not want to participate in the process. They did not want to take their funds and make investments at a landscape scale instead of trying to just invest on their own site. And this ended up right after we finished the work. Butte Fire occurred right in the footprint of where we were doing this work and where we were trying to put this landscape scale fuels treatment plan into place. And this ended up being the first fire that PG&E was liable for from one of the a nuisance tree hitting one of their transmission lines. Suppression costs alone over 60 million, private value loss over 450 million. People died, lots of homes lost. Ended up with probably $1 billion roughly in total value loss. And since then, as you're aware, PG&E's liability has just snowballed, filed for bankruptcy. And what this taught me was, first of all, that whoever has the deepest pockets might be held liable in the end. But that coordination problem is a real thing. And I think we're getting better at it and thinking about it, but it's too easy to think you're going to just protect your own assets in these scenarios. But another interesting lesson from this work was that East Bay Municipal Utility District, who was relying on this area for their water supply, they said it was easier for them to think about a level of damage rather than a probability of damage, that they're used to making investments to prepare for earthquakes. The probabilistic weighting of costs and benefits was problematic. So I think we have to get better about how we translate and think about those kinds of issues on these investment questions. And so this proactive versus reactive question becomes quite important. And I'll say that the Forest Service and ODF, there's always a lot of thinking of, do we invest more in our ability to react to fires, or are we proactive beforehand? And the reality is it depends from case to case and site to site. And with climate change, that is shifting. I think we know that locally, our adaptation strategies make quite a bit of sense, but at a larger scale, that suppression effort becomes, at least on the fire side, pretty important to keep in mind, because we just can't treat the whole area. We go a little bit quickly in sort of the water equivalent. So we know that water in Oregon is much more abundant than it is in most of the West. And Rob, when we were talking about climate migrants, I mean, one of the things we'll continue to face is people leaving the drier, more water scarce parts of the West to come up to the water abundant parts of the Pacific Northwest, especially the west side, Oregon and Washington. How we're going to deal with that is going to be an increasing challenge, because again, we've got very different conditions from one side of the state to another. So these two charts, the one on the left is showing groundwater recharge across the West, and really Western Oregon and Washington have some of the highest rates of groundwater recharge, which is our best natural storage and natural sort of resilient system for water supply. But the east side is is in bad shape when it comes to water supply, and we're working on crediting trading systems, new infrastructure, green infrastructure to adapt, but it's not going to be easy. And part of the question is, how much is this a state level issue? Should businesses and communities on the west side care about water availability on the east side? I'll say one thing that comes up for us in Bend for water supply investment decisions and planning. The state has told Bend to be prepared that in the eventuality of a Cascadia event, you're likely to see millions of people leave the west side and come over the east side. So the water systems on the east side are part of an adaptation strategy for earthquakes and maybe even wildfire issues on the west side. What we've been working on with the legislature is thinking about some state level strategies on water investment in Oregon. One of the biggest needs that we found is that Oregon lags behind other states in its sophistication with accessing federal funding. There are a whole range and expanding set of federal funding from grants to highly subsidized loan opportunities, and we just don't do a very good job of going after that. So one of the lowest hanging pieces of fruit on water in Oregon is to provide better systems, especially for small and eastern east side communities, to be able to react to and take advantage of federal opportunities. And the reliability of funding sources is particularly key for water investments, because you need to have a steady, dependable stream of funding. And this actually carries over for wildfire adaptation and preparation from a fuels treatment standpoint in your areas. If you're doing fuels treatments, if you want to manage fire risk in your region, you need to do fuels treatments. They last about 20 years, but you need maintenance treatments every 5 years or so. So again, you need sort of these long-term steady systems in place. And this issue of aligning beneficiaries with the funding sources is very problematic on water and fire. And the state is going to need to, in some cases, think about ways to change some of the restrictions on taxation systems so that we can better align the level of funding, the geography of funding, the scale of funding with the scales of benefits and investments and beneficiaries, and take better advantage of the private incentives that are out there so that the private money can be used more efficiently, especially on water conservation, but also in terms of how land and fire risk is managed, especially for homes and communities that are mixed and close to forests. I'm about out of time. I wanted to give a quick sort of advertisement for continuity of operations plans. This is something that we've done at ECONorthwest as a way to think about short, medium, and long-term adaptation or preparation for various kinds of disruptions or disasters that we would worry about. I was asked to give a talk last year for the Association of Engineers in Oregon, professional engineers of Oregon, to walk through how to think about continuity of operation plans. I'm not going to go into this right now. I don't have a lot of time for it, but it is a federally designated approach and system. There are good methodologies out there. And if you're thinking about this from a business perspective and how you prepare, I think it provides a nice systematic approach. And at our company, we've gone through and practiced. Mike and I have both worked on this at the board level, how we prepare for wildfire, earthquakes, and even a pandemic. And we had done all of this before COVID. So we were in pretty good shape, but it helps you think through back to that production function, that supply chain for your business, where the disruptions are likely to occur. Think about what your options are for investing to prepare beforehand, and where it makes sense to prepare to react rather than spend money up front. And it has changed how we manage a fair number of our internal systems and how we provide for sort of maintenance of our operations and support of our staff through this whole process. So I know we're probably about out of time, and I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So I'll just skip to the end, and I'll just say that thinking through creating resilient systems and sort of short-term, long-term issues, it's useful to systematically walk through, and we do this for agencies, we do it for businesses, understand how you're going to react at different timescales. As Mike was describing and walking through his examples for COVID in particular, that we've got these different strategies that we need to have as we move through it. I think that systematic approach is really key to it. So just sort of in summary, I'm sorry I had to skim through this last part really fast, but understanding what is predictable and what isn't, and how critical those disruptions are going to be, helps to prioritize and think about where the most efficient adaptation strategies are, and where it makes sense to make those insurance investments upfront versus prepare to react later. And with that, maybe I'll stop my slides for now and get out of here, and we can open up some questions. I know we hopefully have a little bit of time left.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Wilkerson, Dr. Buckley. We are now ready to start our question and answer portion. We do have some questions in the chat, and I'll go right ahead and kind of answer them. Oh, not answer them, but ask them for our panelists. These questions are for Dr. Wilkerson from John Down. How does the increase in business formations compare to the number of businesses that have closed in Oregon? In other words, have more new businesses formed since the pandemic started than have closed?
That is, I think, it's a great question, and a little bit challenging with the way that data is reported. So if you look at the Secretary of State's data, net business formation is up. But I think given the rapid change in the economy and what's going on, I don't know that the full extent of business closures has been documented yet. For example, like we've looked at some of the data where you get individual business level reporting. And so many businesses, let's say may have, as an example, employed 10 people and now are employing 0, but they may not have formally closed the business. And so we look at that as like a business suspension, let's say. So I think that nuance matters in a time like this with lots of government programs coming back. The question is, has that business been, have all the exogenous effects around it, including potentially forced closures, impacted its employment? And so is that out of business, or is that just a suspension that maybe can come back? And so if you just look at the net numbers of filings versus cessations of business entities, it's net up.
Thank you. Another question from John. He said, hate to bring up inflation and get that you don't see it as an issue whatsoever. However, you showed us the high level of savings and pent-up demand. Doesn't Econ 101 teach that when demand goes up and supply is constant, then prices rise? Why is this not the case in this situation?
Oh boy. I think at the risk of, if you get 100 economists in a room and you ask them what day it is, you're going to have, you're going to get 7 different answers. My personal opinion, and there is a growing body of economists who kind of don't necessarily believe in the typical theories of Econ 101, right? In that behavioral economics and other things, maybe influence that. I think I'm not suggesting that inflation in the sense of general price levels aren't going to rise. We have seen that, right? But this is like saying if you have a penny and you find another penny, you've just doubled your resources, right? This is like going from 1.4% inflation to 2.4% inflation. And so how does a 1% increase in the general level of prices relative to, let's say, where it was at other times impact the overall recovery? I think the answer is it doesn't. You look at things like the housing market growing at 10% a year, not in there, but things like fuel and grocery costs, et cetera, are in there. And I suspect inflation will continue to tick upward. But I think the general fears you hear are people around the amount of monetary policy and fiscal stimulus that occurs. You should see massive amounts of inflation, 5%, 10%, and those types of events, I think, are what the theory would seem to indicate. And we haven't seen that happen in 20 or 30 years. And so I think that's my main hypothesis, is where the theory typically might tell you you should expect to see huge amounts of inflation. As we measure inflation, right, and there's core CPI, X shelter, et cetera, like I think certainly prices are going to go up. But I don't think it's going to go up in a way that some people are fearing, and certainly not in a way that's going to hamper the recovery.
All right, so this question from Linda might be for Dr. Buckley. In your opinion, is the state of Oregon taking these many environmental issues seriously?
I think so. I think Oregon's in a better situation in terms of sort of accepting the science and recognizing the impacts of, let's say, water availability and drought and wildfire than quite a few other states. But let's say the institutional capacity and the funding capability is probably one of the bigger constraints. I think what we tend to find across the board on our work is that the benefits, that as much as I was talking about the importance of finding those sweet spots and when it makes sense to make an investment beforehand versus prepare to react when events occur because they're not predictable, still we have enough low-hanging fruit still in Oregon in terms of investments we should make beforehand that make clear sense. But the coordination and the funding is the challenge. So California, for example, has a much better system available for state level investments in water. There's no mechanism for Oregon to make state level investments in water. And so I guess I would say that the mindset is there, but we have a sort of some structural constraints on pursuing some efficient investments. But part of the question is, to what extent should business lead on this front? And I think Oregon is a state where when business is willing to lead on these issues and see the benefit in a coordinated way, that the say the state level government is willing, or state level agencies are willing to get behind that and help to coordinate. So I think my point is that we're generally in the right place, but I think the funding mechanisms, given that the scale of these problems don't align well with local jurisdictional boundaries or jurisdictional constraints for land use, means that we probably do need to think about state level action that probably involves state level coordination across agencies, but also potentially new alignment of state level funding. Again, though, largely for the purpose of being sure to take as much advantage of federal opportunities as we can, especially given the high level of federal land management in the state as well.
And I believe those are all the questions we have. And we are 10 minutes beyond our time. Rob, would you like kind of one more question, or would you like to close?
I'd like to hear just kind of a summary, because we are scheduled to 9:15. We talked about adaptation, and you talked about adaptation coming out of a pandemic, which was huge, totally unexpected. Adaptation coming out of climate change, which after the taste of last year, of the fires last year, we have an idea of what that's like. Do you have any words of wisdom for business owners? I saw some of the slides about, disaster preparation, but it was pretty hard to prepare for a pandemic. I think on our office, our best thing we had was that we had moved all our servers offsite to Easy Street. So we were able to operate remotely, and we were able to operate when the wildfires shut down the power. But could you have any recommendations for businesses, just, from what you've done and from your research, just a quick 1 minute summary?
Yeah, Mike, do you want to go first? You want me to take a crack?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we saw fueling what was previously the longest expansion in U.S. history was really the expansion, I would call it, of the gig economy. And right, so it's people who weren't typically able to be employed in what was previously traditional employment agreements, say W-2 employees, in person, in place, 5 days a week. And that really allowed people who are on the sidelines to figure out ways to engage in the economy. And what we've seen now is, certainly from a regulatory standpoint, the questioning, at least legally, of how sustainable those types of employment agreements are in terms of the true independence of those contractors, et cetera, particularly in states like California and Washington have really been going after that. And I think what the pandemic really has, I think, offered is a new model, right? So it's one where now, through Zoom, through screen sharing, through, to your point, Rob, the cloud being everywhere, et cetera, is how much do we actually need to be all in the same place in order to conduct business? And figuring out how sticky what we've seen that's been forced upon us is versus what opportunities there are to kind of continue to grow there, I think is going to be key. Unfortunately, I think many of the people who have exited the labor force, now disproportionately women, certainly, largely due to school-age children, is going to be figuring out what that new expansion is that allows for that to happen. And so, particularly in professional services, I think we're pretty well situated, and we're seeing lots of growth starting to emerge. I think navigating these next 6 months, there's going to be probably abnormally large amounts of turnover as people start to realize that there are other options out there, including we're seeing lots of hiring happening now where in person in a location isn't required. So someone will get hired with the expectation that you might move in 6 months. Whenever that happens, that never really has been an opportunity before. And so the labor market now is much more regional and national than it ever has been. And so navigating that period of high amounts of turnover and what that new normal is, I think is going to be key as we get into whatever amount of growth we're going to see. Certainly predictions on the GDP side are 6-8% year over year. But again, for some context, we're still down 3% from where we were at the peak. So this is really just kind of getting back to where we were and then growing a little bit is kind of what we're looking at over the next 3 quarters, let's say.
And just to extend what Mike was saying, I think we've learned quite a bit from the COVID experience that's relevant to climate kinds of concerns, especially wildfire and water, that those adaptation strategies that work in terms of geographic flexibility, which systems can move and which ones can't, helps us think about where we want to adapt. I think the big difference, though, is that COVID hits every area geographically uniformly. You can't leave Oregon and go to Idaho to escape exposure to infection. But for wildfire or drought, there is this geographic opportunity to relocate, that if there's a fire in one area, people are going to want to try to move and think about what can move and what can't move. Similar for water and drought, we're talking about farming, or even communities might need to adapt in that way. I think the bigger issue for Oregon is that we're not likely to be experiencing these at the most severe level in the West. And so the pressure from especially businesses and households in California coming up increasingly to the Northwest, and what that kind of pressure is going to mean. In the world of water management, for a long time, people for decades sort of joked that maybe we should just build a canal from the Columbia River down into California. If we don't do that, either send the water down or the people are going to come up. And I think the reality is we're going to see the people coming up. And one of the issues I didn't mention that on climate science is suggesting that we might actually get more total precipitation in Oregon with climate change, as opposed to California, we're expected to get less total. So increasingly, there will be forces attracting people to the region when we're thinking about climate-induced effects. So a combination of short-term reaction when events happen, but also understanding the long-term trends and sort of that medium to long-term adaptation process that we'll expect people and businesses to take.
Very good. Thank you very much, Dr. Buckley and Dr. Wilkerson, for speaking to us today. I do want to tell our audience, and also I want to thank our sponsors again. I want to tell our audience that we are planning our fall 2021 Cruzway Economic Forum, slated now for Thursday, October 7th, with Cyril Del Summers McGee from Workplace Change. And we're going to be exploring diversity in the workplace and how to attract and retain a diverse workforce, which is going to be very important for the 21st century business economy. So we want to thank you for participating, and we will have this recorded, and so many opportunities to share this with colleagues. Thank you again and have a great day.